breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Joe Crowley. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of intimate partner homicide, criminal negligence and scuba diving. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Joe.
Now, I'm interested in this case because it's a Queensland case.
It is a Queensland case.
And was big news here in Queensland, but I think all over the world, also certainly in America.
Well, it had tendrils in the US as well, which we'll talk about. But also, this was requested multiple times on one of our TikTok
Oh, fantastic.
fans. Yes.
Oh, there you go.
So I saw the request there and I thought, I can look into that one.
Yeah, I can do that. Well, but don't leave us in suspense.
No.
Who are we doing?
So we're doing the Honeymoon Killer.
Bum, bum, bum.
Also, he's known as the Honeymoon Killer, but Gabe Watson.
Yes.
Victim Tina Watson, his very brand new wife.
Yes.
Yes.
Was the book, because there was a book written on this, was it called Honeymoon Killer?
No, the book was called, I actually have that information.
Oh, sorry.
Joe. No, that's all right.
Irrelevant. Just jumped in my head.
I will tell you the name of the book when I get to it. But it was written by two criminologists, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
All right. So timeline.
Yes.
We've got a few things I'm going to work through.
Mm-hmm.
But the murder, the death
Mm.
occurred in 2003 in Queensland.
Mm.
There was a coroner investigation and that report was delivered in 2008.
Yep.
Then we had criminal proceedings in Queensland in 2009. And then there were criminal proceedings in the US 2011, 2012. So it is an old case and there's nothing recent about this case really. I did find an article from 2023, 20 years on from the death with Tina Watson's mum. But there's no legal long-term implications. But it is an interesting one with that dual prosecution between
I've got
Queensland
some strong
and
opinions
the
on
US.
that.
I'm sure you do.
But yeah, I went looking when you said you were going to do this for the book, and it's not in print anymore. And it's you can't get the talking book either. Maybe it was never done as a talking
Really?
book. Yeah, I was a bit disappointed in that. I was going to listen to it.
Oh, well, I came across the book because when I was doing my research, I found a book review written by an academic who I actually know.
Oh, really?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
okay.
That's how I stumbled across the book.
Yeah.
So I haven't read the book either.
Okay.
No. So let me tell you about what happened. The victim in this case was Christina May Thomas, who had married in October David Gabriel Watson.
October, this is 03.
03.
Yep.
So she was known as Tina. He was known as Gabe.
Yep.
And I will refer to him just as Watson throughout.
Yep.
So they got married in Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Famous for civil rights activist stuff. Well, that's how I remember it.
I did not have that connection, but good. Thank you. And they had met.
Well, sorry, Letter from the Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King.
Did not put that together.
Okay.
Yes. Not my first thought.
That's right.
Tina met Watson when she was in college, and in early 2003 they got engaged. She was working at that time as a retail manager and she wasn't in a huge rush to get married, but she was keen to become a mum, have a family. So they set the wedding for October 2003. Her dad, who has since died, sadly, walked her down the aisle. They were so happy for her, excited. And Tina and Watson had planned a honeymoon in Australia, and a big part of that was so they could go scuba diving. So,
Great Barrier Reef.
yes, Watson was an experienced diver.
Yes.
He'd undertaken multiple diving trips, and he had also done a diving rescue course in 2001, which is relevant.
Yes.
Tina had a little bit of diving experience. Some of the things I read said she'd never dived in open water.
Right. Just in swimming pools or something.
Yeah, I guess so. But so definitely nowhere near as experienced as Gabe. And so they arrived in Sydney firstly in October, 17th of October. They did a bit of sightseeing. And then on the 21st of October, they went to Townsville in Queensland.
Yep.
Now, prior to arriving, Watson had made arrangements with the Mike Ball Dive Expeditions Company for this. It was a long dive trip.
Yep.
It was to the Yongala shipwreck, and they were going there on board a vessel called the Spoil Sport.
Okay, interesting.
They had brought with them their own diving equipment.
Really?
Apart from the tanks.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So their own wetsuits, goggles, masks,
yes. Yep.
flippers or goggles or masks.
Dive watch.
Dive watch.
Apparently.
Okay.
I think.
Interesting.
And then the air tanks obviously were provided by the company.
Yeah.
So, and I should say these facts I have taken from the coroner's report.
Got it.
Okay.
Because it doesn't go on appeal, so there's no appeal report?
No appeal.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, sorry. There's a sentence appeal.
Ah, okay.
But not for the conviction.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So they went on board the ship at about 10 p.m. On the 21st of October. There were other divers as well on board, and they travelled 48 nautical miles to the Yongala wreck site. It was located near Cape Bowling Green, if anyone is a diver, wants to place where this is.
Yep.
So they got there and moored at about 2 a.m.
Yeah.
So it's a protected shipwreck. It's situated in about 30 metres of water, and it's subject to lots of protections. You have to have the permits and the supervision to be diving on that.
Okay.
When they were on board, the dive company required all the divers, including Watson and Tina, to provide written records of their diving experience and their history.
Yep.
So they had to verify, according to their own protocols, that they had the experience. There was a general safety briefing, and the safety protocols were also explained.
Yeah.
And this is relevant because, as a little side note, the company also had some questions to answer.
Yeah, I was going to say that because they're diving in open water, and so they've got Tina Watson who's never dived in open water.
That wasn't part of the coroner's report, but I did read that
somewhere
when
else.
I was looking at the US materials.
Yeah, and have you ever gone to the Great Barrier Reef and done any? I've never scuba dived, but I've snorkeled.
I've snorkeled.
Yeah, and the currents are incredibly strong. You are really out in the middle of the ocean, on some atoll with coral around it. And I'd like to think I'm a strong swimmer. I was in the swim team at school. So, I'm reasonably confident in the water. I was, I thought, this is not, even with flippers on, you want to be very cognizant of being careful. So if you're, with the full tank and weight belt.
There's a lot. And just so strangely, I just read from the library a book I just got out by an Australian author, Ray Cairns. And it was all about scuba diving and a wreck,
There you go.
And then
this is one of your murder mysteries that you love.
Yeah, it was really good.
Okay.
It was really good. Anyway, so I feel like I have a little bit of extra knowledge I may not have had without that.
I think you're an expert. Let's go with it.
All right. So between 9 a.m. 9:30, they attended a pre-dive briefing.
Okay.
There is also evidence to say that they were offered a sort of introductory course that they could do before the dive, and they refused.
Right.
Gabe and Tina refused.
Well, you can understand why Gabe would refuse. He's pretty, and he might have said, "Well, I'll show you what you need to know, love. Come on, let's just get diving."
And that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, so they then got ready for their dive, and with 4 other divers, they took a little tender over to the access point of the wreck, and they entered the water. Now, almost immediately they came back up, or Watson and Tina came back up because there was an issue with Watson's dive computer, which he wore on his wrist.
Got it.
They adjusted that, and then they returned to the access point and they re-entered the water.
Got it.
So the sequence of events from that point on, there is corroboration from the other divers, but of course, you're not talking to anyone underwater.
No.
The divers are doing their own thing.
Yes.
You've got a dive buddy.
Yeah.
But they're doing their own thing, exploring as they wish.
Yeah. And the other thing about, I certainly find in snorkeling, is the limit of your vision. You've got no peripheral vision because the goggles cut that out. You're really looking straight ahead. So if you want to, you really have to scan left and right a lot if you want to sort of have a broad view of things.
Yes.
So you're not catching stuff out of the corner of your eye. Somebody could be right next to you and you wouldn't even know it.
No, that's right. Yeah, and you're very focused on, what you're actually doing. So it seems that they had only been underwater for around 6 minutes and that Tina had gotten into trouble. And so Watson had gone over to her and was trying to help her adjust her air tank. She had very heavy, like 20 kilos of weight belt, which was too much apparently for her size.
Because she wasn't a big woman, was she?
No.
But he was a big bloke. Am I right in remembering?
Yeah, he looked very tall and solid.
Yeah.
And so then she was struggling a bit, and he said that she knocked his mask off. And so he'd been holding her, and when his mask got knocked off and his air piece, he was putting that back in, and she started to descend. And he said by the time he had adjusted, she'd gone maybe 10 meters, and so he thought he'd go back up to the surface and get help.
Yeah.
And so it took him between 1 and 3 minutes to get back up to the surface. And he raised the alarm, and other people dove in to find Tina, and he stayed on board. There is evidence that he wanted to go back in, and he was prevented from re-entering by one of the crew.
Right, okay.
So when the skipper, maybe that's not the correct phrase, but the
captain of the ship,
the lead diver, went back down, he did find Tina face up on the ocean floor.
Yeah. And
they brought her up, not to the Spoil Sport, but to another boat that was quite close. And for 45 minutes, this fellow and another crew member attempted to resuscitate Tina. They were performing CPR. During that whole time, Watson stayed on the other boat. The Spoil Sport didn't come over to see what was happening with Tina and didn't in fact come back over to where Tina was until after she was declared dead or was unable to be resuscitated.
And what do we make of all that information?
Well, I'm just giving you the facts at this point.
Okay.
Just giving you the facts.
Okay.
Now, we'll get into it a little bit, but he gave lots of inconsistent statements. The court says there were about 16 inconsistencies in what he said had happened and his reactions and why things occurred and all of that sort of thing. So that worked against him in the eyes of the police for sure. And there was some other evidence which I'll get to. But so just in terms of the cause of death, this was the focus for the coroner because it was very difficult to know exactly what had happened to Tina while she was underwater. Nobody could specifically say that Watson had done anything directly to cause her to die. So her cause of death was recorded as drowning, but the coroner investigated the idea of whether it was an accidental drowning. And apparently there are a number of ways that you can accidentally drown. Well, no, it is. It's arrhythmia, obstruction caused by vomiting, a laryngospasm, or because of anxiety and panic. And so the coroner considered whether those played a factor in her drowning death.
Got it.
But based on the evidence that was put forward by medical professionals, the coroner was satisfied that none of those were present or applied in Tina's case, that it was not an accidental drowning, as in those factors didn't play a part.
I've got some question marks over all this, but yep.
I'm sure you do. And so then they looked at, well, was it possibly a murder? And they talked generally that, there are 3 sort of scenarios for a murder, that it was a heat of passion kind of thing, that Watson had suffered a mental derangement underwater, and whether or not there was motive for him to have killed her.
This is just unbelievable. They've got A plus B equals Z. I mean, this is just the logical flaws in the police's reasoning just phenomenal. Anyway.
Well, this was at the coroner's investigation.
Yeah, okay.
So he clearly did not have a mental derangement. And so they did look at that question of motive. There was evidence that before they got married, don't roll your eyes.
I am rolling my eyes,
okay.
For those watching on YouTube.
There was evidence before they got married that he had asked Tina to increase her company insurance and to make him the beneficiary.
Wow.
And Tina,
how odd.
And Tina had, I'm sorry, I have been married for nearly 25 years. I've never once raised a question of let's increase our insurance, let's make sure I'm the sole beneficiary. Certainly not before we got married.
No, okay. But, I mean, they're getting married. He just might be, more sensitive to his financial situation or their financial situation.
That's a kind way of putting it. I feel like that kind of thought process is like it's predicated on her dying. He's thinking about...
I've had discussions with my wife and with our accountant about what kind of level of insurance we need in case she dies or I die and what
I bet you that happened when you had kids.
Well, the problem is I had kids from the get-go, so it's never a period of my life where I didn't have kids.
Well, that was the impetus in our marriage. It was making provision for the kids.
Yeah.
It wasn't to try and benefit each other in the event of death.
Well, there's no point in leaving all the money to a baby. You'd leave it to your spouse on the basis they'll look after the baby.
Let me move on.
Okay.
So she had talked about that with her dad, that he'd asked that, and her dad said, look, just tell him it's been done and we'll deal with it later.
Yeah.
So she didn't change it.
Sure,
so he was not the beneficiary.
No, okay, but but the dad didn't go, oh, this guy seems weird.
No, but he also anyway.
Well, I think the reactions of people at the time are, you need to take those on board.
All right, now the investigation after she died was a little bit delayed because of things like how long it took to get the body back. From open water and I think working out which jurisdiction it should go to, but it ended up coming back because it occurred in open water.
Oh, it was on the high seas.
Well, I think it must
Where
have
were they
been.
going to send it? Tahiti? I mean, honestly.
Well, no, but it came back to Townsville.
Surprise.
But that played a part because it meant that there was then delay in speaking to witnesses and getting accounts of things. And because of the nature of it, I don't know that all of the witnesses were still local. So, it did have some forensic disadvantage in that the investigation itself was delayed a little bit.
Yeah, but that could be disadvantage to Gabe Watson too, because the evidence that helps him and descriptions that help him are...
Oh, both ways. That's right. Yeah, I'm just noting.
Yeah.
But so he had said to police that while he was ascending after he lost hold of Tina, he encountered a diver of Asian appearance and signalled to that individual that Tina was in distress. Now, all of the other divers present in the water that day were contacted, and none of them said that happened. There were 2 witnesses who had to give their responses through email, I think, and so that took a little bit more time. But again, they denied explicitly any encounter had taken place. And so the coroner also looked at evidence like the estimates of Watson's ascent rate following his separation from Tina, and that's because when the lead diver went down and retrieved Tina from the ocean floor, it took him 90 seconds to get her back up, and Gabe had taken between 1 to 3 minutes.
Who is timing this stuff? I mean, how do they know?
It's on the Dive Watch, the Dive computer.
Okay.
They have evidence of it.
Right.
You're so skeptical of every single bit of evidence. Good Lord. They also looked at his previous and recent dive experience. his actions in light of the fact he was a trained dive rescuer.
Sure.
And evidence of the rate of flow of the current on the day.
Ah, there you go.
So they looked at all of those things. So the suggestion was that he had held her in a bear hug, and there was some evidence that people had seen them close before she began to descend. So that the theory was he had held her in this bear hug. He had cut off air supply from her oxygen cylinder during that time, and then
so deliberately sort of reached his hand around and turned the little valve off or something.
I'm not sure how it works, but yes.
Right.
Bear hugged her until she suffocated, then turned the oxygen back on before he let her go.
Okay.
And then
sounds ridiculous.
He ascended and raised the alarm.
Yeah.
So he obviously said, no, I panicked at the circumstance we were in, and I accidentally let her go.
Yeah. Occam's razor. Sounds much more sensible and
likely.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen it, but there is a photograph of Tina
I've
lying
seen it.
On the ocean floor.
It's the cover of the book. That's one of the reasons I remember the book.
Right.
Because it's such a powerful photo. Sorry, I interrupted your description of it.
No, it was Tina lying on the ocean floor, and it wasn't taken of her.
No.
It was another diver who'd taken a photo of his wife and captured Tina in the background
lying on the ocean floor.
Yeah,
it's
so
haunting.
Sad. Yeah, it's
People
really.
can see it online, I'm sure, if they Google it.
So when she was recovered, they did find her equipment was functioning correctly and her tank did still contain air. So she hadn't run out of air and it hadn't malfunctioned.
No, she did have a weight belt on. It was too heavy though.
Yes. All right. So I talked about what happened. Now, he was not present for the coroner's proceedings. He had returned to the US.
Mm-hmm.
He claimed privilege against giving evidence, which I didn't know you could do in a coroner's court.
Oh, interesting. Well, they would have coercive powers, one would assume, to subpoena, but presumably they can't. If you claim the privilege against self-incrimination, then they can't do anything.
But I did also realise, because the finding of this coroner, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the finding of this coroner was that he was to be committed for trial. And I was like, that's not a function of a coroner. But under the Coroners Act 1958, which was in force then, that was one of the functions of the Queensland coroner.
To act as a sort of a committal hearing.
That's right.
Wow.
And so that all changed in 2003, just after, was it 2003? Well, there was a new act in 2003, which established a new regime, which obviously changed those functions.
Yeah.
But so at this time, that coroner still had the power to commit him for trial, and that's why it happened.
So this is why people listen to this podcast, because they love the legal nuance that we go into.
But I find that so interesting.
I do too.
Because I think that should be a function of a coroner.
Yeah.
I listen to or read so many coroner reports that say I find X or Y is responsible for the death,
and then
nothing happens.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I want to go back and read the X notes of that legislation to see why they changed it. I didn't do that for you guys.
Okay.
All right. So I found an article that really went into depth into what Watson's story was. So I'm going to tell you what he said.
What the article said.
He didn't, which I think was taken from a US proceeding. But so he didn't give evidence at this coroner's hearing.
Yep. Okay.
But he said that a strong current caused them to drift off course. Actually, I know where this evidence is from. After the US proceedings finished, he went on a show called 2020 in the US. Right. And this was his version from there.
Got it. Years after the event.
Years after the event.
Okay.
But I think consistent with what he had basically told police at the time.
Got it.
So he said they were moving quite a lot. He wasn't expecting it to be moving so much with the current. Obviously, neither was Tina. He said when they were unable to swim back against the current, he motioned to her to fill up her buoyancy compensator so they would start floating up, but it didn't work. And so he realised he had to help her. So he grabbed a hold of the buoyancy compensator strap, pulled her in, turned and started heading back to the anchor rope. He said he then felt a whack across his face. His mask got displaced. And so he said he let go of her to replace his mask. And when he looked back, she was 10 feet down and still sinking. He said she was face up and she had her arms up. She was reaching out for me to grab a hold of her.
Wow.
I know.
That's very sad. And then he swims the opposite direction.
He said, I kind of turned my head, gave a few kicks down to see if I could grab her, and she was still out of arm's reach. And I just decided I got to go find somebody. And so he left her there.
Okay. Odd choice.
Odd choice.
Sure, but we don't know what we would do in this panicking.
No, but I think that's where
situation.
It does become relevant that he had that dive rescue certification, because I think that is against the training you would get.
Oh, for God's sake. That's like, somebody who learns karate knows how to fight. I mean.
No, it's not. If you have CPR training,
you have the training. That doesn't mean in a pressure-filled emergency situation you'll do it.
No, I know, but it's not like if I got stuck with someone who was drowning, I wouldn't know what to do, but he'd had training is my point.
Sure. I don't think you needed much training to swim down, grab her and take her to the service. I mean, but Blind Freddy knows that one.
Okay. All right. So the coroner listened to all of that evidence, found that his inconsistencies, the 16 that were noted, undermined his version of events.
Sorry, who said that? Oh, the coroner.
The coroner. And so committed him for trial.
Eye rolling for anybody who's not watching on
committed
YouTube.
him for trial. Little bit on the side was this issue of the dive school. So part of the remit of the coroner's investigation was to consider if they had any liability.
Well, putting a weight belt that's too heavy on a small woman, I would have thought, is a good place to start.
So they had to consider whether the dive school should be required to verify that prospective participants hold the level of certification they claim to hold.
Okay.
And whether a rescue diver's certification should expire after a certain period of time. They were the specific questions to be considered.
Is this because Gabe Watson had done his rescue dive thing years earlier?
3 years before.
Right.
Yeah. So,
as I say, I'm not sure it was really relevant.
No recommendations were made about that. They found it would be problematic for a rescue diver certificate to have an expiration date. And they accepted there was no problem in relation to the first issue because the diving code that they were operating under requires production of the license held by a diver. So there was no recommendation to be made. Those things were a non-issue. But the dive company were in fact convicted of breaching the Workplace Health and Safety Act and were fined $6,500 and costs of $1,500.
What was their breach?
The charge related to a failure by the company to comply with its own procedures.
Okay.
And the coroner accepted that after Tina's death, their training procedures were immediately reviewed and steps implemented to ensure that procedures would be maintained and followed in future. So I think that was like the introductory dive, maybe was part of that. Anyway, that was a little side issue, but they did have some responsibility in that respect.
Yes.
All right, so he gets committed for trial and the DPP proceed.
With what charge?
A murder charge.
Right, okay.
Okay.
Overcharging again.
He voluntarily returned from the US for that trial in 2009.
Yeah.
So there was a fair bit of attention on this proceeding and the public, as well as I think some members of the court, were surprised when rather than a trial commencing, Watson pleaded guilty to manslaughter instead.
I'm not surprised. Nobody who, followed this case or had even a basic understanding of law would be surprised by that. Surprise, surprise. So he's guilty of causing the death through criminal negligence, presumably. He had a duty to look after his wife. He failed in that duty. She died. He's negligent.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was a duty of care under Section 290, which is sort of like this general duty to act. And that was attached to him because you always have to establish why a duty attaches to someone because, we actually have no responsibility to help anybody in trouble.
Yeah, so to put that in context, if Gabe Watson's there scuba diving by himself and he sees another diver in trouble who he's a stranger to, he has no responsibility to help them.
No.
But because it's his wife...
Well, and maybe more so because he was her buddy.
Ah, okay. And he'd already started to help her, and so he had to continue to help her.
Yes, so two things. Yeah, those two things. Yep. He had that connection to her, and that was deemed to be an undertaking for Section 290.
Yep.
But also, even if that wasn't found, if you do start to help someone in trouble, then you assume that duty voluntarily,
Yes.
and you are compelled then to do everything reasonable
Yeah.
to continue helping that person.
Yeah.
And so there was a strong case
Yeah.
for the duty to exist in relation to Gabe.
Yeah. So one wonders why they just didn't start with that, why they started with murder, where they've got a proven intention to kill or do serious harm.
You have never been a prosecutor. So
No. I mean, sorry, in terms of a bargaining position, it's always better to start high because then you can bargain down.
Well, and the coroner committed it for trial on murder, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. I'm not entirely convinced by it. I've got some question marks over some of the coroners.
Formally charged him with murder, cautioned him, and closed the matter.
Yeah, but the DPP can alter that.
They can, but they also had police officers who had been investigating who felt strongly that murder was the correct charge, and I'll come back to them. Stop rolling your eyes at me, for goodness sakes. All right. Now, Watson had logged 56 dives across his scuba diving experience, so that I think is a lot. I don't really know.
I don't know, yeah.
Tina had 11 and only recently certified, and I don't think in open water.
Got it.
So the judge accepted that he had failed to carry out his duty to her in a number of significant ways. So the judge said, I accept that you failed to do so in the following respects. You failed to ensure that when she encountered difficulties, she had a supply of oxygen available to her, and in particular, you failed to share your oxygen supply with her. Having released her to recover your face mask and oxygen supply, you did not then take hold of her again or stay with her or follow her as she sank. You did not attempt at any time to inflate her buoyancy control device or remove the weights which they carry to assist them to descend. You failed to make any reasonable attempt to take her to the surface. I therefore accept that you are guilty of the very serious departure from the standard of care which was on you. And said, and therefore is deserving of criminal punishment.
Yes.
And that's the threshold.
Yes.
You can be negligent in relation to someone and it not be criminally negligent. It has to be what we call gross negligence. So such a departure from the standard expected. And the judge was happy with that.
Yes. Did you know which judge it was? This is no, don't. Personal interest.
No, because I actually didn't read that judgment. I read the Court of Appeal judgment who quoted the trial judge or the sentencing judge. That acceptance of the plea bargain to manslaughter by the prosecution rested on the premise that he did nothing to cause her problems in the water, that was a spontaneous event, but that he had committed the criminal act in failing to rescue her. So that was the basis of the plea and the basis upon which he was sentenced. So in terms of that agreed statement of facts, it was tendered to the court. You know, often that happens. Prosecution and defence work out the basis for a plea and they present that to the court. And so that's what happened. It was an agreed statement of facts.
Yeah, and that's important because there's lots of ways that a crime can be committed. So just because you decide to plead guilty to something doesn't mean you're going to agree with the way that you're said to have done it by the prosecution. So prosecution and defence will sit down and work out together what the accused is going to agree to. And that is effectively then an admission to those facts.
Yes.
You know, which is important. It's a confession effectively.
Yeah. The prosecutor said it must have been clear to the accused, Watson, if he left her, she would most certainly die. It's almost inexplicable that he would make the decision to leave her.
Okay. I'm not sure that is going a bit beyond the facts.
Sorry,
but sure.
You literally just said something similar to that before.
No, so the prosecutor says he must have known she was going to die when he left her. I don't think that that's part of the criminal negligence. He just has to accept that he didn't do what was reasonably expected of him.
But
he didn't have to project forward and know that she's going to die.
But that's okay to say, well, part of the gross negligence is if it's an obvious outcome or if it's so unreasonable to do something other than what you did.
Well, yeah, but unreasonable to do. So you say, well, you should have taken her weight belt off. You should have made sure she had a supply of oxygen. You should have shared your oxygen. That's different from you knew when you swam she was going to die.
Okay, but because not doing those things is going to mean she's descending.
Sure. He mightn't have turned his mind to it, for example. Apparently he had his mask knocked off and his thing out of his mouth.
All right.
You know, he might have been more interested in saving himself.
So anyway, there was a little bit of consternation in the public and also
in the
from
newspapers, let's say.
With the media,
in the media,
and from Tina's family
sure.
that this
they'd lost their daughter. They're understandably upset.
Plea deal had been accepted. You are just interjecting at every point when I'm trying to tell you my story.
Okay.
The DPP did not reveal very much about their decision to accept the plea to manslaughter. The only statement provided said, given the complex circumstantial nature of the case, Mr. Watson's admission that he breached his duty to render assistance to his wife ultimately meant that there was no reasonable prospect of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of murder. So that was the official statement.
Yeah, because just in a practical sense, what would happen, and I've actually done this before, if you plead to a lesser charge, like you go in front of the jury and you make them read a lesser charge and you say in front of the jury, I'm guilty of that. And then they go, we're not accepting that. And then they run a higher charge. You know, you can appreciate the jury might be like, what are we all here for? I mean, they've accepted guilt.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be impossible for the prosecution to still run
no, of course not.
A case on intent.
But you do sort of wedge them.
Well, and I say to my students often, that the prosecution is not, acting for the victim. They're there to serve justice, and you have to weigh up your reasonable prospects of trying a case and doing what will serve justice overall. And so if he's accepted that liability, you can understand going to trial on a murder charge which was circumstantial and not a definite slam dunk.
Yep.
Probably justice was served by accepting that plea.
Yeah.
I agree.
Certainly, I think I'm all in favour of the plea bargaining system, and it often comes under criticism. I think by people who don't work in the system. It is so valuable in terms of saving public resources and money.
Yeah.
And it does. It does serve the interests of justice, and it does serve the interests of victims in that they do get a conviction. It just isn't necessarily the conviction for a more serious charge.
I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I do think one of the dangers of a plea bargain system is that there is evidence that people will take a plea or make that plea because the chance of being tried on a more serious charge and being convicted is compelling.
Oh, I totally agree.
And so there is evidence of people who have entered a plea as part of a plea bargain who were not necessarily guilty.
Not even guilty. But yeah, bird in the hand's worth two in the bush. Better to take a lesser punishment that's guaranteed.
So that,
than,
I think, is the criticism.
Oh, and it is a valid criticism, but I think that if we got rid of plea bargaining and you had to just run everything to trial, it would just overburden the system. And, I mean, in my experience, so many trials are avoided because of plea bargains.
Yeah, well, and I did read, so some commentators on this case talk about the fact that there were financial reasons for the DPP to take the plea. Saying that it saved them like $2 million from running the trial.
Because they would have had to get experts in.
Yeah, of course.
Long trial.
I mean, that was definitely not listed as a reason. But then Watson was also quoted as saying, to fight the whole thing, I could have been held on remand for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. The amount of money that it would have cost for a trial, there was no way, that he was able to do that.
Yeah.
So
what sentence did he get?
Oh, let's talk about that. It's my next
boom.
heading. Very
yes,
good.
Yes, it is.
So at sentence, along with the details of the breach itself that we've talked about, the judge noted a number of additional considerations that he was weighing up. The tragic consequences of the death of Tina for other persons, especially those who provided the victim impact statements. The willingness of Watson to return to Australia at a time to face the murder charge. The significance of the plea in the administration of justice, which the judge also accepted, was an indication of remorse.
Yes.
And so, we do give a benefit to those who plead guilty for those two reasons, saving the court's time and
showing remorse.
Signifying remorse.
Yep.
There were references attesting to his otherwise good character.
Okay.
Joy.
We've talked about those kind of things on this podcast before.
One consequence of the delay in the prosecution of the case was that Watson had it hanging over his head for some years. The adverse position he found himself in because of extensive publicity in the meantime, and his generally cooperative approach, notwithstanding some discreditable conduct in seeking falsely to blame others, which was a flash in the pan kind of argument from him.
Right, okay.
Okay, so prosecution said a sentence of 6 years would have been appropriate before taking into account matters in mitigation.
Yes.
And their ultimate submission was at least 5 years imprisonment to be suspended after 18 months.
Yes, so that's only 18 months in prison and then he can go, but he's got to be of good behaviour effectively.
Yes, and it's a definite release date,
Yes.
not like a parole eligibility date.
Yep.
Yep. I could not find in the Court of Appeal document what defence submitted,
No.
but the judge imposed a sentence of 4.5 years to be suspended after 12 months.
Yep.
So that had very strong views when that was publicised.
It's only 6 months less than the prosecution were asking for.
Well, we don't know what the public reaction would have been to the 18 months if that was initially entered. But 12 months does seem very light for a manslaughter charge, even on the basis of criminal negligence.
Well, have you got some comparables?
Well, I do. And we actually did a whole episode, not for this kind. And in fact,
we did it on manslaughter. It wasn't criminal negligence manslaughter, was it?
Yes.
Oh,
that was
geez.
those
We've
parents.
done so many. Oh, the parents.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
So hold on. So the judges, because there were 3 judgments from the Court of Appeal, and I read all of them. All of them said there were no precedents that matched these facts. Like it was one of its own. And a breach of duty under 290 is actually, I think this was one of the first.
Really?
Yes.
Because it's been around for 100 years, hasn't it?
I know, but it's like this catch-all duty. So we've got 4 other duties that are available and they often seem to fit the facts better. So they said there were no comparable precedents.
Yeah.
And so they were trying to find similarities as they do with past manslaughter cases. I have always thought that manslaughter cases get quite low penalties on occasion. And we talked about that with the parents responsible for the deaths of children through negligence.
Yes.
And they would get between 6 to 9 years for those. We did just have the Elizabeth Strews case. That was also conviction on the basis of criminal negligence,
Just
manslaughter.
remind me the facts on that one.
That was the little diabetic 8-year-old.
Oh, yes.
So,
and the religious family who didn't give her the insulin.
And so amongst other penalties, the 2 main offenders there got 14 years for manslaughter. So it's a huge breadth of punishment open because it's just a maximum of life rather than mandatory life, which is murder.
Yeah.
That caused some concern that he would only serve a year in prison for Tina's death. And the Attorney General.
In the newspapers.
Yes, and with Tina's family.
Oh, sorry, and the Attorney General appealed.
The Attorney General appealed.
Well, some more beyond the career mail, with complaints about it, all right?
Yes. And so on appeal, the prosecution submitted that a period of imprisonment of 7 years with a recommendation for parole after 2.5 years was appropriate.
So they're changing their tune?
They did change their mind.
Okay.
Their concluding submission said, and I'm quoting the whole thing because I liked it, a criminally negligent killing of a human being should, in general, warrant a substantial period of imprisonment. A head sentence of 4.5 years does not adequately reflect the community's justified revulsion at conduct admitted to be criminally culpable and by which he's deemed to have killed a young woman. Thoughts?
I don't like the use of the word killing. I'm just trying to think. I think it probably fits with the words of the section, but I would have thought causing the death is probably a more appropriate description.
That's the legal definition of killing.
Yeah, I
Cause
know.
the death of another.
That's why I said I think it fits what that's said. But anyway, I'm just not happy with the wording. But yeah.
So obviously on appeal from a sentence, the question is whether the original sentence is within range. So,
manifestly inadequate if it's a Attorney General's appeal.
Oh, yes, sorry, if it was manifestly inadequate. So, but they're looking at what was done by the original sentencing court to see if it's within the parameters.
Yes.
Yeah. The Court of Appeal felt that this case was one where the relevant risk to the victim was or should have been appreciated in light of his substantial experience and qualifications. they found that his breach of duty was a fundamental one, and quoted the prosecution's submissions about the consequence to Tina as a result of his breach of duty being virtually guaranteed, which I know you just said you didn't like.
No.
They said he virtually extinguished any chance of survival by allowing her to sink to the seabed. And so they said it is quite different from cases where there's a small risk that the offender has not appreciated or considered, but they're still held to be liable because they should have.
Yeah.
They said that the one thing Watson was called to do via his duty to Tina was to bring her to the surface. This was simple to accomplish, and his failure to carry it out was unexplained. All right. So they found that, and one judge wanted to give more time in custody, but the other two were, well, one wanted to dismiss, the other one was happy with the sentence that had been imposed as a head sentence, so the 4.5 years. So that remained, but they did increase the suspension period to 18 months. And so that's what he ended up serving, 18 months. Then he was released. They said it was appropriate that he be suspended so that he didn't have to stay in Australia. He could go back home. And it was Chief Justice de Jersey who had some agreement with the prosecution. Anyway, so that was the outcome. He had to serve that 18 months, which he did, and then he returned to the US. While he's serving that time, Tina's family, in particular her dad, Tommy, was feeling upset about this. They had wanted a jury to judge Watson, to look at his conduct and to make a determination on the murder charge.
Well, what if they'd said not guilty?
What if they had? They said that they wanted that to be a process that he was subjected to.
Okay. I'm not sure how they would have felt if the jury had said not guilty, but yeah.
Yes, all right. He worked hard to try and push for justice for Tina as he perceived it.
Yeah, thank
and
you
so
for
that,
adding that bit, yes.
And that involved, working with the US Attorney General at the time. And because they said, the Americans said that he had planned the murder while in the US, they were entitled to prosecute him there.
Sure. I mean, he wasn't convicted of murder here, so I don't know on what basis they're saying it's murder. And they're really just, gerrymandering a reason to prosecute him because this is presumably the Attorney General of the state who's an elected representative who needs to go to an election and show they're tough on crime.
Senior Queensland investigators shared the Thomas's family anger, particularly Detective Constable Kevin Geringer, who told media the justice system has let us down. The book that we've referred to, here's the title, A Second Chance for Justice, The Prosecutions of Gabe Watson for the Death of Tina Thomas, written by criminologists Dr. Asher Flynn and Dr. Kate Fitzgibbon, looked at the Queensland justice system. And they claimed that the courts at that time were falling well behind national efficiency standards. This is what drove the plea bargain. And that overworked prosecutors were given an average of 79 cases a year in Queensland compared to other counterparts from different states where they were getting about 27 cases per year. So they said it was a matter of expediency to satisfy the overworked prosecution and to save money as well.
Interesting.
Yes.
Neither person have ever worked as a prosecutor or in the criminal justice system, so I think it's important to think about what their opinions are.
Yes. Several witnesses were interviewed, eventually leading these authors to form the opinion that Watson had intentionally killed his wife.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Well, there we go.
Yes.
Shut
and Detective Geringer
Yeah.
was quoted as stating, "I honestly think that just prior to her death, she was fighting for her life."
Oh, I think it's important for the detective to speculate on what was going on in the situation he wasn't at. Yeah.
All right. So at the conclusion of his prison sentence, he was deported back to the US, and there he was immediately arrested on murder charges.
Yeah. Conspiring to murder, was it, or something?
Well, it says murder charges.
Okay. Yeah.
So the Attorney General, Don Valeska, had
Yeah.
presented evidence to a grand jury to indict him on murder.
Yeah. So that's like our committal process where they're sort of investigating whether the information they have is enough to proceed with a prosecution.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like the idea of a grand jury.
Yeah, it's got some merit, yeah.
Within 5 hours, the jury had agreed and indicted him on charges of capital murder for pecuniary gain.
Oh, for God's
They
sake.
also charged him with capital murder by kidnapping, but that kidnapping charge was withdrawn at the start of the trial.
On the basis of what? He tricked her into marrying her?
I'm just saying.
I mean,
So the prosecution in the US argued that he had turned off his wife's air supply and held her until she was unconscious. The prosecution said the problem is all the times the defendant has lied. Why is he lying?
See, it annoys me so much that lay people, but also lawyers, have this binary notion that people are either telling the truth or lying. And that is, in my experience, is just not the case. There is a whole range of things people might be doing in terms of if they're not telling the truth. For example, they could be mistaken, or they could have convinced themselves of something which they genuinely believe is the truth, which isn't the truth. It's not necessarily a lie.
Do you accept that often criminals do lie?
No, I don't.
Joe.
Well, if you had said, do I accept that criminals lie, I would have said yes. But you said often criminals lie. I'm not sure, except they do it often.
I'm sure they do it often.
Okay.
Defense counsel, a fellow by the name of Bloomstom, told the jury that the dive was a perfect storm of bad decisions, many of them made by the dive shop that arranged the trip.
Yep.
He claimed that Tina was a green diver sent on a dangerous red flag dive, that they did not make her take that introductory orientation dive, and that she was outfitted with 20 pounds of weights too heavy for her body.
Yep.
This case is not about whether or not he could have saved her. It's whether he intentionally killed her, and he did not, he told the jury. Now, you will be happy about this because the judge pretty much refused or ruled out all the evidence that the prosecution wanted to rely on. Yes.
Okay.
So prosecutors couldn't afford to produce key witnesses from Australia.
Surprise, surprise.
And so 3 pieces of evidence in particular were excluded. First, police here had videoed a reenactment of the dive with the advice of local oceanographers, and that cast doubt over Watson's version of events. Before you interrupt, just listen. The judge refused to allow it to be admitted as evidence because they couldn't call those scientists who worked on the reenactment, and therefore they couldn't be cross-examined. Yeah. Police also uncovered an email that Watson had sent the dive operator 5 months before the honeymoon, inquiring about that Yongala site. An employee had replied to that because Tina was an inexperienced diver, she should either take an orientation dive or not dive at the site at all. And that email apparently contradicted Watson's statements to police after Tina died, where he told them that he didn't know anything about the dive before they did it.
Mm-hmm.
The judge refused to allow the evidence to be used because the employee who wrote the email was unable to testify.
Mm-hmm.
The judge also refused to allow Tina's father to testify about the increase to the life insurance policy conversation that had taken place.
Well, because it's secondhand hearsay. She says to her father, Gabe has said this to me.
Yes.
The father then gives evidence of what she said, he said. So double hearsay. It's just unreliable.
So as a result of that, the chance of him ever being convicted by a jury was nil in the opinion of that judge, and so he entered acquittals for Watson, which meant end of the matter.
Yep.
Cannot be tried again because it's a verdict.
Yes.
And so again, the Thomas family felt a bit gypped that they had thought that he would be judged by jury again. Didn't happen. They weren't necessarily saying he would have definitely been convicted, I don't think, but I guess they wanted that to be explored in court as to the murder charge. Closure, I don't know. The family of Watson also felt a bit, they said they also would have thought a trial would have been a good thing because they believed in his innocence.
Mm.
Now, interestingly, as part of that whole US proceeding, they needed to get evidence from Queensland, and there was a blackmail allegation against the Queensland Attorney General at the time, Cameron Dick, in 2010.
I don't remember this, yeah.
No. So Alabama's Attorney General accused the Queensland authorities of blackmail over the state's refusal to share evidence in the Gabe Watson case.
Okay. Sounds odd.
Yes. He said that it was an outrage. This is the then Attorney General, a guy by the name of King in Alabama.
Oh, a different Attorney General from the one who
ran it.
Right.
Yeah. He said it was an outrage that Queensland authorities had refused to cooperate with their investigation until the death penalty was taken off the table.
Nice.
Yeah.
Sorry, I do remember this.
Do you?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's in line with the Australian law.
Oh, it absolutely
certainly in line
is.
with extradition.
Remember we talked about in the Bali 9 case that, they made public statements about the death penalty.
Yeah.
But so this guy, King, said what is now being done is blackmail by high-level Australian authorities to extort justice itself, to say to the state of Alabama, we won't do for you what you did for us. We told you a crime had been committed in Australia and we asked Alabama authorities to cooperate. Well, we readily turned over every file.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what any of those files are relevant. I mean, all the evidence against Gab Watson was from Queensland.
So the then Attorney General of Queensland, Cameron Dick, wrote a formal response to King, outlining the reasons behind the refusal to share information. And the big one was that they wouldn't cooperate with a death penalty case.
Which is absolutely in line with the Australian law.
Yep.
And but sorry, it's not that they wouldn't cooperate, it's that they put a caveat on cooperation. We will cooperate if you do this.
Yes. Well, King was saying that it hamstrung
for God's sake.
I know.
And there's this
anyway,
obsession with the death
penalty.
They
took it off the table. And Cameron Dick was quoted as saying, we stand willing to provide the information that has been requested. If they give an undertaking, they will not pursue the death penalty.
There you go.
So there you go. And so that's pretty much the case. He's now remarried, apparently, to a Tina lookalike.
Okay. He's got a type. That's
he
right.
has a type.
No law
That's
against
fine.
that.
No law against that.
Do they scuba dive?
I did not find that out. I probably wouldn't. And the only other recent thing was that article I found that was with Tina's mum, Cindy. And I guess in the interest of the case unfolding and the plea deal and then the US, you do forget, or not forget, but like it's a life sentence for
the pain
family,
of the family,
and
absolutely.
she says that every day she still misses her. And I think Tommy, her dad, had really been active in trying to pursue that US prosecution, and it was a bit of a, what's that phrase? The cause
celeb.
Or the reason.
The raison d'etre.
Yes, that one.
Right.
And I think he died maybe in 2022. But so, I think as a case of manslaughter, it's such an interesting case. And I do teach it, like I talk about it. And I did read another whole article about this duty of care. And, was it right that he had that duty as a husband? Did he have a duty to her diving? If you're a dive buddy, often you're buddied up with someone you've just met. What is that duty that you have there? I think in this case, you hit one of those points that he did start to help her. But also I think he wasn't just a dive buddy and he wasn't just her husband. He was both and he had the experience.
Yes.
And so I think it absolutely was the right outcome that he was held liable for not helping her. 18 months, as a prosecutor, I always think more is better. I just feel like it's not a lot for a life, but that's the system, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it, but it's not. You're not trying to equate the one against the other. I mean, I don't think that is that in the sentencing guidelines.
What?
What's a life worth? We would have sentenced you to that. or what's an
Well,
assault
that's
worth.
the whole idea of precedence. You look at what's happened in past cases.
Yeah, but they're taking into account a whole series of criteria, which you're taking into account as well. But I'm not sure. I mean, you are looking at the gravity of the offence. So I suppose you are sort of weighing it up.
That is what you're weighing up.
Yeah. How would you quantify a life? I mean, you for a murder, you get life imprisonment in
That's
Queensland.
right.
So.
I mean, and so when you
for a life.
compare it for a lesser charge, but still one that acknowledges you're responsible for the death.
Causes the death, yeah.
It is a very light sentence compared to life imprisonment.
It's 4 years. Well, it was 4.5 years was the sentence. He just only spent 18 months in jail.
Yes, the semantics, Joe. It was an 18-month sentence.
Okay.
All right. I think that was everything I wanted to say.
Okay, interesting case. Well, I'm glad we did it. But sorry, I think there's 2 books because the book you mentioned wasn't the one I was talking about. I think the one I'm thinking about is called The Honeymoon Killer and has the photograph that we talked about with with Tina Watson in the background on the floor of the ocean.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I didn't even see a copy of this book that I referred to.
I think they're all out of print now because it's such an old case.
It is an old case. But, if you go diving, stick with your
I
buddy.
don't. Yeah, stick with your buddy. Just snorkel like I do. All right. Thanks, Lizzie.
No worries. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.